Long before the written word captured the fears and imaginations of Europe, stories were whispered by firelight. Among the Slavs, one figure stood out as both terrifying and strangely fascinating, the Striga. To understand this creature, we must return to a time when night itself was alive with unseen dangers, and when every shadow carried the possibility of something lurking beyond the ordinary. The legend of the Striga emerged from the belief that some people were born different, marked by signs that separated them from the rest of the community. A child born with two hearts, or with a second row of teeth, was seen as touched by a dark fate. In other variations of the tale, it was said the Striga carried two souls, one tied to the living body, the other restless, slipping away at night to wander and feed. Such traits, rare and misunderstood, inspired fear and suspicion among villagers who looked for explanations for the unexplainable. Folklorists note that the concept of the Striga spread widely across Slavic lands, with variations found in Poland, the Balkans and beyond. In some regions, she was called a cursed woman. In others, a restless spirit that could not find peace in the grave. What connected all these variations was the association of the Striga with sickness, sudden death, and the slow draining of life. When someone in the community grew pale and weak for no reason, when livestock fell ill or crops failed without cause, villagers whispered that the Striga had passed in the night. It is important to remember the context of these beliefs. In a world without modern medicine, sudden death was common. Plague, fever, and unexplained illness seemed like supernatural curses. Sleep itself was dangerous, for many never woke again, leaving behind grieving families desperate for explanations. The Striga became that explanation. A monster who preyed upon the living, feeding on their blood or life force. Fear gave her form and repetition gave her strength. The more the stories were told, the more real she became in the minds of the people. Early chronicles describe rituals carried out in villages to prevent the birth of a Striga. Babies born with unusual features might be abandoned in the forest or buried alive, grim measures reflecting the desperation of communities. Later traditions softened these horrors, suggesting protective charms or rituals to ensure that such children would not return as monsters after death. Even so, suspicion remained, and families carried the weight of fear in their hearts whenever such signs appeared. In the end, the legend of the Striga was more than just a tale about a monster. It was a mirror of human anxiety, a way to explain loss, sickness, and the fragility of life in a harsh and uncertain world. In those villages surrounded by dense forests and endless night, the idea of a creature born from within the community itself, feeding on its own neighbours, was the most terrifying of all. The Striga was not some distant beast. She could be someone you once knew, and that made her legend all the more haunting. When villagers spoke of the Striga, their descriptions carried a consistency that burned images deep into collective memory. They said she was pale beyond death, her skin stretched tight and cold, sometimes tinged with a grey or bluish hue. Her hair was described as long and tangled, black as raven's wings, or in some tales white as bone. But the most terrifying feature was her mouth. Legends insisted that her second row of sharp, jagged teeth glistened in the dark, built for tearing into flesh. Her eyes were another mark of her unnatural state, glowing red, sometimes green, always unblinking, as if she could pierce directly into the soul. Strigi were often depicted as women, though some accounts suggest men could also bear the curse. What united them was their unsettling presence. The creature was said to move in unnatural ways, jerking forward in sudden bursts, or gliding with eerie silence, leaving no trace on the earth. Animals were the first to sense her. Dogs would growl and bark at the empty night, and horses would rear without reason, their instincts detecting something invisible but deadly. At night, the Striga left her resting place, sometimes a shallow grave, sometimes a ruined hut on the edge of the forest. She would stalk quietly, searching for prey. Her hunger was not random. Legends claimed she preferred infants and children, for their souls were easier to drain, their bodies weaker to resist, yet no one was safe. Adults would wake with scratches across their chests, their skin pale, their energy gone as though something had pressed upon them during the night. This gave rise to one of the most enduring images of the Striga, the night visitor, crouched on the chest of her victim, pressing the breath from their lungs while feeding on their life force. It was this detail that linked her in many minds to nightmares themselves, the suffocating weight that paralyzes the body in sleep. Villagers learned to look for signs of her passage, a sickly pallor spreading through a household, livestock refusing food, crops withering overnight. All could be blamed on her hunger. Sometimes those who crossed paths with the Striga claimed to hear an unnatural shriek in the darkness, a sound so piercing it froze the blood. Others said they caught glimpses of her silhouette against the moonlight. Thin limbs, wild hair, teeth flashing in a cruel grin before she vanished into the night. Fear of the Striga shaped nightly rituals. Before bed, doors were bolted tight, and garlic was hung near windows as a ward. Mothers placed iron objects beneath cradles, believing the metal would repel the creature. Fathers drew protective symbols onto door frames and carried knives close at hand. Yet no measure felt truly safe. Stories told of families who tried every charm and every prayer, only to lose loved ones mysteriously in the night. Such tales reinforced the sense that the Striga was not simply a beast. It was an inevitability, a shadow that could not always be held back. And so, when dusk fell and the forest grew thick with darkness, people whispered to one another, "Do not stray too far, do not sleep alone, do not ignore the barking of dogs. For if the Striga found you, her hunger would be silent, her grip unrelenting and her curse eternal." Legends rarely left people without hope, and even the Striga, terrifying as she was, could be resisted, at least in the tales told from village to village. Defence was never simple, for this monster was thought to be tied not only to the physical world, but also to forces of the spirit. To fight her, people combined ritual, superstition, and sheer bravery, creating a blend of practices meant to ward off or defeat the creature. One of the most common defences involved the use of iron. Knives, nails, and sickles were placed near beds or hung over doorways, as villagers believed the cold strength of the metal disrupted unnatural forces. A sharpened blade tucked beneath a pillow became a talisman of protection, a silent promise that the Striga could not cross the boundary it created. Mothers would hang scythes in stables to guard their livestock, and blacksmiths were often called upon to craft small charms of iron for families who lived in fear. Garlic, too, played a role in resisting her presence. Bundles were tied to cradles and worn around the necks of children. The pungent smell, it was said, offended her corrupted senses and forced her to turn away. Alongside garlic, blessed herbs such as wormwood or juniper were burned in homes at night, their smoke filling rooms with a protective haze. In some regions, holy water was sprinkled around thresholds, and families prayed nightly to saints for deliverance from her hunger. Yet charms alone were not enough. To truly end the curse of a Striga, stories spoke of more drastic measures. If her identity was known, if someone within the village was suspected of carrying the curse, then the burial rituals became vital. The suspected Striga's body might be dug up and reburied face down, so that when it awoke, it would claw deeper into the earth instead of crawling back to the surface. In harsher versions of the tale, a wooden stake was driven through the heart, or the head was severed and buried separately to prevent reunion of body and soul. These grim measures, though brutal, reflected the depth of fear that drove entire communities to act. There were also legends of confrontation, when hunters or brave men faced the Striga directly. These encounters often involved ambushes during her nightly wanderings. Armed with iron weapons, sometimes blessed by priests, they would wait in silence until she appeared. The battle, as the stories tell, was no ordinary fight. The Striga was fast, unnaturally strong, and fueled by relentless hunger. Only the boldest could stand against her shrieking attacks. Some tales ended with triumph, the monster slain, the village freed from her grip. Others ended with tragedy, the hunter torn apart and the Striga vanishing into the forest once more. An unusual thread runs through a handful of accounts. The idea that the Striga could be cured. In some traditions, if the cursed woman was caught and confined, and if no one approached her for 7 nights, she might regain her humanity. This strange belief suggests that beneath the monstrous shell still lingered a trace of the original person, a fragment of soul capable of returning if denied the chance to feed. Whether this was an act of mercy, or simply another way to explain the unpredictability of her appearances, it offered a glimmer of hope in an otherwise hopeless story. These defences, iron charms, herbs, rituals, and even cures, paint a portrait of how deeply the Striga was woven into daily life. She was not just a creature of myth, but a constant threat that shaped how people slept, how they buried their dead, and how they guarded their children. Every precaution became a ritual, every night a battle between safety and fear. And in that struggle, the Striga lived on, not only as a monster, but as a reminder of how fragile the boundary is between the living and the dead. The Striga did not exist in isolation. Across Europe, folklore teemed with creatures that fed on fear, blood, or life itself. Yet the Striga remained distinct, carrying traits that blurred the line between vampire, ghoul, and spirit. To understand her, it helps to see her alongside these other figures and to notice what set her apart in the eyes of the people. Vampires are perhaps the most familiar cousins of the Striga. In Eastern Europe, tales of vampires spread widely, describing pale figures rising from graves to drink the blood of the living. The Striga shares much with them, her nocturnal nature, her hunger, and her association with illness. But there is a crucial difference. Vampires were often strangers, corpses risen from forgotten graves or cursed outsiders. The Striga, by contrast, was rooted in the community. She could be a neighbour, a child born with unusual traits, or a woman whose death was followed by unexplained misfortune. This closeness made her more unsettling. Where vampires were invaders, the Striga was betrayal from within. Another creature often compared to the Striga was the Upior, or revenant. The Upior was a restless corpse, reanimated by unnatural forces and known for spreading disease. Like the Striga, it stalked at night and left its victims pale and drained. Yet the Upior was more grotesque in description, swollen with blood, bloated, and often accompanied by the stench of decay. The Striga, on the other hand, was unnervingly human-like. Her appearance might be twisted and monstrous, but she could still resemble the person she once was. This thin veil of humanity made her harder to identify, and therefore more terrifying. The Striga also shared elements with nocturnal demons found in other cultures. In Germanic lore, the mare was a spirit that pressed upon the chest of sleepers, suffocating them with dread. In Greek tradition, the Lamia hunted children at night, stealing their breath. These beings reflected universal fears of sleep paralysis and sudden death in slumber. The Striga fit seamlessly into this pattern, embodying the suffocating terror of night pressing down upon the vulnerable. But again, her defining trait was her dual nature. She was not merely a spirit, but a being tied to flesh, cursed with 2 souls, both restless and hungry. One of the most striking differences lies in the cure. Vampires in most tales could only be destroyed through stakes, fire, or sunlight. Ghouls and demons likewise had no redemption. The Striga, however, carried the possibility of salvation. That rare thread of folklore suggesting she could be cured set her apart. It implied that the Striga was not entirely lost, that something human still lingered within the monster. This possibility added layers of tragedy to her legend, for she was both predator and victim, cursed by fate rather than purely evil. Even the way she was feared showed her uniqueness. Villagers guarded against vampires with garlic, against spirits with charms, and against demons with prayers. But against the Striga, they did all of these and more, layering superstition upon superstition. She embodied not one fear but many. Fear of sickness, of betrayal, of restless dead, of suffocating dreams. That made her not just another monster, but a symbol of every shadow in the night. By placing the Striga among her folkloric kin, we see how she reflects both the common fears of humanity and the distinct anxieties of Slavic communities. She was part vampire, part nightmare, part revenant, but never wholly any of these. She was something else, something closer, something that belonged to the village itself. And it was this closeness, the idea that the monster might be your own kin, that secured her place in the darkest corner of memory. Though centuries have passed since villagers whispered of the Striga by firelight, her shadow lingers. She's more than just a figure of old folklore. She's become a symbol, a haunting echo of human fears that never fully vanish. In the modern age, we no longer huddle in wooden huts surrounded by endless forests, but the image of the Striga continues to resonate, adapted into literature, film, and games. She remains proof that the monsters we imagine are never truly gone. They evolve with us, following wherever our fears lead. In stories retold today, the Striga often appears as a villain, a cursed woman who prowls graveyards and ruins. She surfaces in novels of dark fantasy, on screens in horror films, and even in popular games where her shrieks echo across digital landscapes. Each retelling shapes her anew, sometimes grotesque, sometimes tragic, sometimes both. Yet at the core, she is always the same, a creature that blurs the line between human and monster, between kin and predator. This duality is what has allowed her legend to endure when so many others have faded. Culturally, the Striga serves as a reminder of how communities once coped with uncertainty. She was the explanation for sudden illness, the reason for livestock deaths, the force blamed when crops failed. In a world without science, myth became survival. By naming the fear, people believed they could defend against it. Rituals, charms, and even brutal practices were attempts to wrestle control from chaos. To study the Striga is to glimpse the psychology of survival in a harsh and unpredictable world. There is also a deeper, more human layer to her legend. Unlike distant monsters of myth, dragons or giants, the Striga was intimately tied to the community. She might be a neighbour, a family member, or a child marked at birth. Her horror was not in her strangeness, but in her familiarity. She reflected the fear that evil might come not from outside, but from within. This made her more than just a monster. She was a mirror of human unease, a story that confronted betrayal, loss, and the fragility of life itself. Even today, echoes of the Striga live on in everyday language. The idea of something draining life while people sleep resonates with our understanding of nightmares, sleep paralysis, and illness. The image of a figure pressing on the chest of a dreamer connects directly to timeless human experiences of fear in the night. Her myth explains what cannot be easily explained, wrapping mystery in a face both familiar and terrifying. In the end, the Striga's legacy lies not just in fear, but in fascination. She has become part of a global tapestry of night creatures, sitting alongside vampires, demons, and witches, while still holding her own distinct place in Slavic tradition. She endures because she is not just a tale of horror, but also of humanity, of how people understood sickness, death, and the unknown. To speak of her now is to acknowledge how myth and memory intertwine, how old stories still whisper truths about the human condition. So, when night falls and silence thickens, remember the Striga. She may not scratch at your window or crouch upon your chest, but she remains alive in story, in memory, and in the very shadows that stretch across the mind. And perhaps that is her greatest power, not the lives she stole, but the way she endures, century after century, as a reminder that every fear leaves behind a legend.